Welcome to This is Oregon, a podcast where we take you inside research happenings at the University of Oregon and show you how it applies to your daily life. My name is Molly Blancett, and I'll be your host for this episode. Our guest for today is Lauren Goss, the inaugural athletics archivist in Special Collections and University Archives. Welcome, Lauren. Can you start by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your work?
Thanks, Molly, for having me on the podcast today. I'm Lauren Goss. I'm the athletics archivist at the University of Oregon. I work in Special Collections and University Archives. I'm based in Knight Library here on the Eugene campus.
So what does it mean to be an athletics archivist and to preserve the history of sport? Seems like a very, very big job.
Yes. So my primary responsibilities are to preserve, promote, and provide access to our materials that document the history of sport here at the university. So I work with researchers here on campus and from around the world. I teach classes, I create exhibits, and I do a lot of outreach to share the UO story with the broader community.
How did you get into that role?
Yeah, so I've been in the role now for a year and a half, but I've worked for the archives for a decade now. So it's a privilege to be in this role and one that's really personally meaningful to me. I'm a third-generation UL alum, and my mom was an athlete here in the 1970s on the field hockey team. So I have a lot of pride in this university. It's the place where I got my degree, and it's a place that intertwines with my family history.
Wow, what special connections there. When you look at the Olympic and Paralympic movement through a historical lens, what themes or patterns stand out to you most?
Yeah, when I think about the Olympics and Paralympics, the first word that comes to mind is global. But then it's complicated by the fact that it's individuals and teams, and then for 3 weeks, every 2 years, they're becoming symbols of their nations, right? But it's all on the backdrop of sports. But then it's complicated even more by the global media, right? So we're looking at the Winter Olympics, and in 1956, when the Winter Olympics were held in Cortina, Italy, those were the first Winter Games to be televised, to be broadcast. So you didn't have to travel to Cortina to be a part of it, right? And so you can suddenly watch the event in your living room, talk about it with your family and friends, maybe your coworkers the next day. But then the global nature of the sports have been exponentially greater, right? It's not just television anymore. People are on social media. There's like behind the scenes of like the Olympic Village and all of their training. And so the sports are really more than just the event themselves. It's like this global event for 3 weeks.
What's it been like for you as an athletics archivist to watch kind of the evolution of how we consume Olympic sports, Paralympic sport over the years?
Yeah, it's just grown exponentially. And I just think about what it would have been like to watch the games for the first time on television, not just read about it, in the paper or like the next day, but actually watch it yourself and see these amazing athletes. And, especially if they're setting a new world record or get a personal best, and just the excitement and emotion of all of that. And now you can share that on a global stage.
What kinds of materials surprise people most when they hear athletics archive?
People may correctly assume that we have lots of visual materials, and we do, photographs and films, videotapes, and other kind of sport programs and ticket stubs, those sorts of things. But especially at a university for our athletics archives, the threads of our stories are spread out among, our administrative and operational records. So my favorite one is tucked away in the meeting minutes of the executive committee of the Board of Regents of the University of Oregon, right? So on the morning of November 15th, 1919, the board decided that they were going to transfer their authority for naming the newly created athletic field here on campus. They were going to take their authority and give it to the ASUO, which is our student government. So earlier that year, the student government had pledged a $10,000 bond in 1919 to build the grandstand at the athletic field. So the act by this board, that's just in a few sentences, that's what allowed the students to proceed later that day with naming the new athletic field in honor of Bill Hayward. And that's how we get Hayward Field. So we can talk about Hayward Field and look at photos out of it and video of it, but then there's just this single moment where that's how Hayward Field began.
Wow. How do you come across those nuggets of our history?
Doing lots and lots of research and just being really curious myself. So looking back through the records and wanting to figure out and answer those, what might be seemingly, simple questions of how is Hayward Field named Hayward Field? And then going back through, and it's kind of like being a detective and pulling on all these different threads and knowing where to look. And yeah, it's really exciting work.
It sounds like it. When we talk about the University of Oregon's Olympic and Paralympic legacy, what does that phrase really mean to you as a historian?
Yeah, so I see it from two lenses, right? We've had our first Olympian was in 1908, so we've had a long history of athletes that create and promote the university's legacy, and they're become known on the global stage. They're inspirational. We all kind of feel that duck pride, and we're so happy for their experiences as Olympians. But also at a university, we have incredible faculty and students that work on research and innovation. So we opened our School of Physical Education in 1920, and that was the first school in the United States. And so the dissertations and research that came out of that, looking at body mechanics and movement and skills testing, right? How to know if you're being, excelling at your sport. But then also with the Olympics and Paralympics, there's so much that goes into that. It's so multidisciplinary. And so we have great faculty here on campus, like Bettina Cornwell, who works on advertising and marketing, and then Susan Sokolowski, who works on innovative product design. So especially going back to that idea of the Olympics and Paralympics being so global, there's just so much that goes into the sport itself more than just the event.
How early does U of O's connection to the Olympic movement begin, and how has it evolved over time?
Yeah, so our first Olympian was Dan Kelly. He won the silver medal at the 1908 Summer Olympics in London in the broad jump, which is essentially the long jump as we know it today. And he was coached by Bill Hayward. He was from Oregon. We've had a really strong showing, of course, in track and field, led by some really phenomenal coaches like Bill Hayward, Bill Bowerman, Bill Dellinger, Tom Heinen, and continuing on through the modern day. And I think it's also supported by the tracktown community that we have here. It's a strong history of hosting major events like the Olympic trials for track and field and the World Athletic Championships. But we've also had Olympians in men's basketball, women's basketball, softball, baseball, swimming, wrestling, golf. I think there's a few more sports in there as well. So we've had a really strong showing of the connection between the university and the Olympics.
From your perspective, how have U of O athletes and coaches influenced global sport and not just competed in it?
Yeah, so in our university archives, we have Bill Bowerman's collection. It's over 100 boxes of material showing his coaching and teaching and his connection with the Olympic movement. He was involved with the high-altitude training for men's track and field leading up to the 1968 Summer Olympic Games that were held in Mexico City. So Mexico City is at over 7,000 feet of elevation. So to run and compete at a high level at that elevation is really challenging, right? And so the USOC wanted to explore high-altitude training to prep the athletes so they could compete at their highest level. So in the collection, you can see Bowerman's correspondence and notes about selecting a location for a training camp. So in addition to looking at Lake Tahoe, they were also looking at Flagstaff, which is, of course, if you're in the running community, that's another place for high-altitude training. So really interesting to look back at the ideas from several decades ago about how to create a plan for optimal training at high altitude.
But we were the first to do it? Is that what you're saying? Even though we're very close to sea level?
I don't know if we were the first to do it, but I'm taking the team there and getting them prepped. So not just leading up to the Olympic Games as an individual, but thinking about how the Team USA was going to perform and thinking about how to optimize and enhance training.
From the records you work with, how have college athletes and college coaches influenced the Olympic movement over time?
Yeah, so college athletes and coaches, and I think also just universities in general, it's important to look at the influence of the NCAA and the collegiate system here in the United States. So leading up to Paris at the summer 2024 games, the NCAA put out a press release and they counted over 1,200 current, former, and incoming NCAA athletes that competed for over 125 countries. So there's this really strong connection between the collegiate system and providing that training ground for current and future Olympians. Team USA's roster included 385 current, former, and incoming student athletes, and that made up 65% of the entire U.S. Olympic roster. So I think it's really important to look at the connection between the collegiate system and all of the training and the facilities and the coaching that then leads to success at the global stage.
And these collegiate teams are made up of people from all over the world. So you get these global teams in these U.S. communities.
Yeah, and I think that also leads, especially like in track and field with our, here at Hayward, we get to know these athletes as people competing for the University of Oregon, but then we also get to see them on the global stage, and they have that really interesting connection.
It's always exciting to see a duck perform
and
compete for different nationalities.
Yes.
What role do places and venues play in shaping Olympic history, and why do certain locations become symbolic over time?
Yeah, I think about this from a couple of different angles. I've been talking a lot about how media is really important. So whether it's television broadcasting or photography, it kind of fixes a venue in the public imagination. It's the place where something happened. You can see that event, and especially with anniversaries and celebrations, and every 4 years when we think about the Olympics again, we think back to the history of these different places, and it kind of preserved that specific historic moment, right? A moment of victory, or the opening ceremonies or closing ceremonies, right? And so I'm very interested to see with the 2028 Summer Olympic Games in Los Angeles, right, the representation of the city and California and the United States, especially through the medium of the Coliseum, right? Because they've hosted it there in 1932 and 1984, and now we're coming back from a third time. So it's this venue that's been on the global stage, and then it will be again in just a few years.
That's so exciting. And compared to some of the other Olympic venues and host cities over time, I mean, LA almost seems like our backyard.
I know. Yeah, so close. And there's such a connection, I think, on the West Coast. And just since it was only in 1984, we can have, some of us can have memories of that and feel kind of like a connection. And so Olympics, watching the Olympics can be a generational thing, right? Where if you've had family members who remember watching the 84 Olympics and now you're watching it in 2028.
Yeah, and here in Eugene, we won't have a time difference with the events. From an archivist's perspective, what makes a venue like Hayward Field historically significant beyond just the events that it's hosted?
Yeah, so Hayward Field is over 100 years old. It's had many different iterations of what the venue has looked like in terms of the location of grandstands and bleachers and other things. And so that kind of leads into kind of the memories and storytelling around Hayward of kind of being this sacred place. It's often referred to as a cathedral for track and field. And so as an archivist, I pay attention to how those narratives are constructed and how memory is constructed, right? So through exhibits and anniversaries and just the human element of everyone experiencing Hayward in different ways, whether you're an athlete or a fan. It all contributes to this construction of a narrative of this really symbolic, sacred place. And as a runner myself, I also buy into the allure of it, right? So finishing at Hayward Field, right? So we have our Eugene Marathon, and they finish their 5K, half marathon, and full marathon. You get to do a half lap on the track. I still get a rush of adrenaline when I get to finish on Hayward. It's a special place.
It really is. Is there a particular object, photograph, or document in the archives that really captures the UVO's Olympic story especially well?
Yeah, so we have this letter from Bill Hayward. It was written in 1923 to the president of the AAU, the Amateur Athletic Union. And so he is making a bid for Eugene and the University of Oregon to host the 1924 Olympic tryouts for the West Coast for track and field. So there were West Coast tryouts, East Coast tryouts. So this is only 3 years after the track was completed, ready for competition. And he lists several points in his letter in favor of being the host. And my favorite is he says that the track is considered by all athletes who have used it to be the fastest one on the coast. It's only 3 years old, right, at this point. But I think both positioning the university as a place to host high-level competition, they're already thinking beyond just the collegiate level, right, that Hayward could be a track, not just for a university, but for a place competing on the national and international stage.
Wow, what vision to think of the different events that it's hosted since then. What's another lesser known story from the archives that you wish that more people knew about?
Yeah, so in the archives, we have materials that are not completely related to the university, but more to the state of Oregon. And sometimes it's interesting to think about the ideas that didn't fully come to fruition, right? So in thinking about the Winter Olympics, I found an article in our student newspaper from 1986, and there was an alum of the university, this man named Sam Lackoff, and he decided that he wanted to position Oregon to host the 1996 Winter Olympics. So his idea was to utilize Mount Bachelor, Mount Hood, and then here in Eugene. So the idea for Eugene was to put a dome over Autzen Stadium to host the opening and closing ceremonies there, as well as ice skating. There was already a campaign around the time to put a dome on Autzen that didn't come to fruition. But I just think it's really interesting. These stories don't happen, right? So they don't enter our collective consciousness as an event that happens. But that's what I love about working in the archives, the serendipity of coming across these lesser known stories and people's ideas and imagining what it would be like if Oregon hosted the Winter Olympics or the Summer Olympics.
Oh, wow, that's wild to think of a dome over Autzen.
I know.
When you work with these materials, do you ever see moments where sport intersects with broader social or cultural change?
So thinking about Los Angeles again in the 1984 Olympics that was the first time that women could compete in the marathon. So in University Archives, we have the papers of Kenny Moore, who ran here in the 60s and then went on to have a career in sports journalism. So we have his notes and interviews and documentation from the first women's marathon trials and then following up on Joni Bonight's race. And so I think it's interesting just to see and to imagine what it would have been like to cover the first trials for the women's marathon and then to be there at the first marathon and to see, a woman from the United States win on home soil. I think that would be just pretty interesting to see. And so you can kind of go through and see his perspective of documenting that in real time.
How do you see this Olympic and Paralympic history shaping the U of O's identity today? And not just athletics, but also as a university as a whole.
Yeah, so the university is a global leader in sport and human performance. So we're a member of GSUN, the Global Sports University Network, as well as the WUSE High Performance Alliance. So we're communicating with other groundbreaking and innovative faculty from around the world, right? So if we're thinking about the Olympics as a global event, we're competing and discussing and comparing notes on a global event. Here on campus, we have the Olympic Studies Hub. So this is the first Olympic Studies Research Center in the United States. And it's so much fun to be on their committee, and I get to work with faculty from business, law, philosophy, classics, journalism, product design, human physiology, race and ethnic studies. We all bring these unique perspectives to sport, and we all can contribute our expertise to our larger research on the importance of sport in our culture.
What are some of the end products of that work or the impacts of that work?
We just opened the hub just over a year ago, and so we're still thinking about what's next, but we're really excited about LA in 2028 and Salt Lake in 2034, and just thinking about how, especially hosting Olympic Games in the United States, what we can bring to those stages.
As someone preserving this history, what do you hope future students, athletes, or fans take away from the U of O's Olympic legacy?
Yeah, the University of Oregon has a strong history of competing at the highest level on the global stage, whether that's in Olympic or Paralympic sports, but also in the research by our faculty. And sport history really matters because it reveals how our traditions are formed, how our collective identities are formed, whether that's knowing what it means to be a Duck or what it means to be an Oregonian or what it means to be an American. But then also how sport functions as a shared language for global engagement, right? We can be on this global stage and have people competing from different countries, and you can have this shared understanding through sport.
It makes me think of how some very, very niche sports will just take off during different Olympic cycles. Can you think of something in recent memory that a sport or some sort of moment that really struck a chord with a lot of folks?
Yeah, I mean, thinking just back to my own, experience of sports, and especially with the Winter Olympics, because we don't have a lot of winter sports here at the University of Oregon. So watching things like curling or speed skating, where you can see, like Apollo Anton Ono, and those moments where, I've never been speed skating, but I can certainly appreciate that moment and that effort and cheering for somebody, crossing the line and winning a medal.
I remember when I was younger watching, is it Dan Jansen speed skating too? So very similar. Thank you so much, Lauren, for your time and talking with us about your work. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so as an archivist, we are focused on both preservation and access. Our materials are available to the public. We have a few steps on how to request materials, but I hope to see you in our reading room, and I hope to share the university's history with you.
If you're interested in learning more about what we discussed in this episode, check out the links in the episode description, and don't forget to follow This is Oregon for more stories from the University of Oregon. See you next time. This is Oregon is produced by the Division of University Communications. For more of the latest from the University of Oregon research and news, visit news.uoregon.edu or find us on your favorite social media platform using the handle @UOregon. Thanks for listening, and go Ducks!